This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 449, Agile Methodologies. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we're talking about Agile Methodologies, how you can pick the best one, and why they matter, with our guest, Chris Wells. We'll also cover CKEditor Text Transformation and AutoCorrect as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Chris Wells. Chris is the CTO at Redfin Solutions and co-project lead for the Project Browser Strategic Initiative. He's also been a guest host of this very podcast and appeared quite a few times. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Always good to be here.
For those of you that don't know or haven't listened before, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the next 4 weeks. Matthew Grasmick, a Senior Director of Product and CMS Strategy at Acquia. Matthew has led Acquia's CMS strategy, collaborating across teams to shape Acquia's product vision for Drupal Cloud. He's a longtime Acquian, going on 12 years now, and Drupalist since 2009. Wow. Having led products to market, including Acquia CLI, Cloud IDE, Code Studio, Migrate, Accelerate, Lightning, Pipelines, Node.js, and Cloud Actions. He's also led Acquia's Drupal acceleration team to contribute heavily to Drupal 9 and 10 major releases, Project Browser, automatic updates, Layout Builder, a personal favorite of mine, media, workflow, JSON API, and much more. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And last but certainly not least, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development.
Happy to be here. Looking forward to hearing how I can reduce the number of daily stand-ups maybe, or something else today.
Oh man, I can't wait to talk about that because I got one that'll might help you with that. But before we get there, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solution engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own, to talk about our module of the week. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted CKEditor to autocorrect symbols like the copyright mark, the not equal sign, and fractions from their text equivalent? There's a module for that. It's called CKEditor Text Transformation and AutoCorrect, and it was created in March of 2024 by Jedvan Dias of Redfin Solutions. It has 1.0.0 Alpha 1 version available, which works with CKEditor 4 on Drupal 8, and a 2.0.0 Alpha 1 version, which works with CKEditor 5 on Drupal 9 and 10. It is actively maintained since those were released just a few weeks ago. And it doesn't have a ton of its own documentation, but the module does leverage CKEditor's automatic text transformation, which has a fair bit of documentation on ckeditor.com. It has only one open issue, which is not a bug. It's the project update bots automatically created Drupal 11 compatibility issue, and looks like it only needs info.yaml updates. The site is officially in use by 8 sites, according to Drupal.org. And by default, the module enables 4 categories of transformations. So symbols, mathematical symbols, typography, and quotes. But you can override the module's plugin if you want a different set enabled. And the module also provides a hook you can use to alter the active sets or define custom transformations if you want content creators to be able to use things like custom emojis similar to what you would do in Slack. So let's talk about CKEditor Text Transformation and AutoCorrect.
So just to be clear, make sure I understood this. It does come like with predefined auto corrections, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well that's cool. I harken back to a prank that was played on me where my coworkers actually updated my autocorrect on my MacBook once to every time I typed Drupal, they'd change it to WordPress. So is that something I could do with this module if I wanted to, prank website users?
I believe that I'm not sure if I don't think they have to be prefixed. So presumably you could do something like that, or yeah,
Yeah.
you could potentially do like if your company has a weird spelling and people often misspell it in a certain way, you could have it autocorrect to the right one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different things like that.
Yeah, it's really useful for something like 1/4 is what you type as a user, but it corrects it to the cute little 1/4 fraction, or
Okay.
parentheses, C parentheses, which can turn into an actual copyright symbol. So you don't have to go fishing around in the symbols button and find the weird symbol.
Can you output markup? Like if you wanted to add a soup tag or sub tag or something?
Yeah, it's doing it inside of CKEditor.
CKEditor already does that. They have buttons for that.
Yeah, no,
I think that it wouldn't. Yeah, that would be a heck of a way to use it to do templates and stuff.
It's not really a shortcut though. Like it's not like you're typing equals in some string and it's converting it to something else. I mean, I guess you could configure it to do that. It sounds like, but
yeah, it sounds like you could probably do like colon disclaimer or something, and then have it like inject a whole paragraph if you had like a corporate disclaimer that you wanted to use again and again. I guess that maybe the drawback is you would probably have to configure that in code. So it wouldn't be something that like a site admin could go in and tweak, but there's probably a bunch of creative ways you could use it.
I think that's called text expansion, which, if for any Mac users who use Alfred, you can easily in a UI create your own text expansion. So you just type, DIS and it expands to your corporate disclaimer. There's probably a module for that. This also reminds me of the pirate module. Like it just find and replace certain things. This time it's symbols.
John, do you know the pirate's favorite letter?
Is it C?
Oh man, you just ruined my entire joke.
Yeah.
You're supposed to say R so I can say no, it be the C.
I know. I'm a dad. I know that joke.
Oh man, I should have asked someone else.
Yeah.
I would have fallen for it for sure.
Yeah. I actually have two questions about this. One is
very good. Get us back on topic.
It says if you enable it, it's automatically enabled for all CKEditor 5 editors. Can you disable it for a particular editor if you didn't want it auto-completing on one particular format for some reason? Or is it kind of one and done? I guess I'm asking Chris because he probably knows better than Martin.
I don't know that much about it, even though it did come out of our shop. But my assumption is that it could, but you'd be in the code using hooks to alter where and how CKEditor is being injected and that sort of thing.
I feel like that would lead to a lot of, but it works for me scenarios.
Yeah, I feel like just even having like one of those checkboxes at the bottom where you can enable and disable certain passes would be helpful. And I'd be surprised if CKEditor, the plugin system didn't automatically do that. Maybe I'll check that out later. The other question, the more serious question is, does this do anything to prevent recursion? So if I add a replacement that includes itself in the replace text, will it detect that replacement and just infinitely recurse and just fill up the body or not? Because if there's no protection against that, that could be an interesting bug. I don't know how you would protect against it, but
if your autocorrect was to take DIS and expand it into a disclaimer, and then the text of the disclaimer had DIS in it, and then it tried to expand that. Though I imagine that would be an upstream bug. Most of this module is just gluing the CKEditor text expansion library into Drupal, into CKEditor. So
I'm sure they thought of that, but I'm definitely testing that later.
I know you are.
Chris, I think you should warn your team there may or may not be a ticket coming in.
Yeah.
from one Nix van.
Hopefully we can send it upstream.
I'd be very surprised if that wasn't already handled, but just for curiosity's sake, I'll double check that.
Dear listener, we'll have an update on that next week. Well, this has been enlightening, and I look forward to doing some text transformation and some autocorrecting in CKEditor. Martin, as always, thank you for a very enlightening module of the week. And if folks wanted to suggest or connect with you, how could they do that?
We're always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all the Drupal and social platforms.
Great. Thanks again.
Awesome.
Thanks, John.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there have been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. We can all agree that while migration is beneficial, it's not always feasible. This is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with Drupal 7 committers and contributors to build and maintain their Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you've come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition and keeps your site secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7's end of life. This enables you to migrate on your own time, or potentially not at all. Hero Devs is committed to keeping Drupal 7 alive and well by even supporting Drupal 7 modules. And if you're planning to be at DrupalCon Portland, you won't want to miss the rooftop party Hero Devs is throwing. Join us at the Hero Devs MidCon Module Mixer on May 8th at 7 p.m. It will be an incredible event to connect with the Drupal community and get some free drinks. For more details and to RSVP, check the show notes to get all of the information you need to attend the coolest party at DrupalCon Portland. And now on to our primary topic. Okay, so Chris Wells, this conversation, today's conversation kind of came out of me watching the video of your Drupal Camp Florida talk, which was based on Agile Methodologies. It was titled "Letting Agile Emerge." So wondering if we can kind of start off with just a really high level overview of what that talk was about.
Sure. Yeah. And I encourage everyone to go and give that a watch, definitely probably at like 1.5x or something. I realized how dense the information was after I got through it. It was my first time presenting. And also you're always my biggest fan, John. I can't believe you were already in there watching my video. I feel so humbled and honored.
There will be a link in the show notes, and I do recommend watching it because there is a ton of information in there. And I was actually having agile issue woes at that point in time, and it was very enlightening.
And it can be timely. I like that. So I think the main tenet that what I found a few months back, I found myself really in the throes of trying to figure out how are we doing project management at Redfin? Just is what we're doing working? Is, going through maybe growing pains or sizing pains and just trying to find what actually works. And I always knew that Agile was not Scrum, but there's a lot of people who really make those things synonymous because it's obviously the most popular methodology to implement the Agile principles. So I kind of was saying, all right, how can we be Agile? What are we doing? What does work for us? And I wanted to kind of share that journey with folks and see if they could relate to it. And some of the inspiration came from having a talk in Lille that was kind of a BOF about Agile methodologies and does Agile work for us? And I really saw a need for a space for people to kind of have those conversations. So I wanted to try and bring that to Florida, bring that over to this side of the planet.
Can you give our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Agile the quick overview of what Agile is?
Yeah. So Agile is I don't even want to say methodology. Agile is maybe at best a framework for how to manage particularly software projects, though it's sort of grown out of software into a lot of different elements, a lot of different industries across the world. But there are really only 4 main values in Agile, which is individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? Which is important to know, that the individuals and the interactions they're having matter more than the actual processes and tools that they're using. The other is tenet number 2 is working software over comprehensive documentation. So more important that the software work than it be documented to a T. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. We think coming from waterfall, the sort of previous, dominant PM methodology, that we put everything down in the contract. We say exactly what we're going to build. And then if we change that, then we need to have a change order, and we need to have more documentation and more negotiation and signing that and figuring out how many dollars that costs. And Agile is really about collaborating with the customer to figure out what we're going to build rather than negotiate the contract. And then the last one, and which is maybe even the biggest one, is responding to change over following a plan. So, heavy specifications, heavy things documented, heavy things in the the contract. Really being able to respond to change is kind of where that word agile comes from. Like, if you're agile, you can adapt quickly. You can, turn the course that you're headed in on a dime.
One of the interesting things there was, and the reason that one of the reasons I watched the video was that last piece that you were talking about, is like how do you handle like changes, right? And I think the different methodologies have different ways of handling those changes. It was interesting to hear kind of what Redfin was doing, what kind of hurdles you overcame in that kind of area. So,
yeah, I thought I knew what Agile was. Like, I knew about the Agile Manifesto. That was like around 2000 or 2001. I actually didn't know these principles. I knew responding to change, and inherently, because I understand the sprint planning and replanning and. But individuals and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, that's really interesting. That gets lost in learning Scrum and Kanban and that other kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. There are some things that require planning far ahead, more than 2 weeks out, right? And a couple examples of what those things are. Like, one, you're mentioning contracts and customers. A customer probably needs to get a sense of the total cost of something. Right? You're like, I have X dollars. I need to make sure this project isn't more than X dollars, and that it gets me at least what I'm looking for. So that's one kind of need. Another need, maybe the more internal facing need, and I think of this because I'm the product discipline. I have to plan my product strategy far out, right? And to do that effectively and to operate on it, I need to go align executives. I got to get my board. I got to know the cost. I got to see if we have capacity, rough understanding of dependencies. So 2 different scenarios, one external, one internal, where I do need some degree of confidence of cost and scope over a medium or long period of time. So how do you square that, and how do you integrate that with Agile?
Yeah, and that I think is just probably one of the biggest gotchas in this realm, especially like in mine as working for an agency, working in a consultancy where you're dealing with customers sort of directly, and you're usually having to deal with budgets up front. So a lot of these Agile methodologies came up in these sort of in-house shops where budget was never really an issue. Timeline was a lot more of the issue of, we're working at IBM, there's 80 engineers, we need to build this software product, and we have to get it to market by September, right? So how do we make that happen? We hire 20 more engineers. Money is, to a large extent, less of an object. And so we talk about, there's always kind of the 3 tenets of software development, right? You can have it fast, good, or cheap. Pick 2, right? And that's what I think does make Agile very different for consultancies. And even for Kitchens years ago, I mean, I think I went to a presentation on this maybe at like DrupalCon Boston.
Not to be confused with 4 Kittens.
Definitely not. Not that I don't even know what that is. I don't know if this was just a joke or if I feel like totally not in the know now that I don't know what 4 Kittens is.
It's a Drupal module, obviously.
Is it really? Oh,
no,
very cool.
No, it's not.
Well, it's going to be by the time Nick gets done with this. And like,
all of 4 Kitchens t-shirts at DrupalCon usually have 4 Kittens on them.
Oh, cool.
I didn't know that.
Sorry, derailed the conversation.
Yeah, so 4 Kitchens they came up with something called consultancy scrum, which is really the idea of like a lot of this. Like this came up from people who really like didn't really have budget as a primary concern, whereas people who work in consultancies, we need to be able to give them some sort of idea of what they're going to get for their dollar. You know, it'd be very difficult to walk into a mechanic and say, I need new brakes and rotors. And for him to say, you know, that might be $80 or it might be $12,000. We don't know. And I don't know when it's going to be done either. And
that actually does happen with mechanics, I feel. But, yeah.
Boy, that would be, I guess, you know, to some extent true. Maybe I've exaggerated where the left and right boundaries are, but to some extent, yes. So in consultancy Scrum, they basically say the only thing that's flexible is features. You have to assume that timeline and budget are always fixed. And so to that end, I think the principle there is you're always negotiating what's going in the product versus not. So you're always negotiating like, well, can we drop blog out for the release and do that later? Or can we drop out, you know, the ability for content moderators to have HTML emails? Can we deal with plain text emails? You're constantly negotiating on feature with the client, and they need to know that there's those 3 pillars and they get to fix 2 of them and the other one's not. And you really need that buy-in and consultancy to make that work. And so that's usually what ends up happening is you negotiate timeline and budget, and you kind of assume that that's fixed, and then you negotiate on features if you need to adapt to change, where they say, hey, we're coming in, and now that we've been working on this for a couple months, there's a new feature that we really need to add. Well, so, would you drop something else or what?
So when thinking about that, right? So like definitely agree with what you said earlier about like, hey, this should be a like customer-centric process, right? And like we should be focusing on customer needs versus like contract negotiations, right? But based on what you just said, right, that can be a little bit difficult, especially in your world, Chris, right, where you're an agency. You know, people are basically like, hey, I've got a fixed budget of this much, like, and we need to get this done, right? Versus, you know, some organizations where it's kind of like time and materials, and it's kind of like, yeah, we have like this budget, but it's usually a larger budget, and you're kind of working within or working down from that budget, right? So like, how do you manage that, right? As far as like, okay, like Redfin works in this certain methodology, and my next question will be more focused on that, but like, we work in this certain methodology, and this does the methodology kind of dictate in which way you guys kind of price your stuff?
Yeah. And I think that not really. The methodology itself, it doesn't really affect what we're building or how we're building it, or, you know, hopefully not the quality to which we're building it.
Sure.
We kind of know that it might take X time to build up, you know, an e-commerce shop with 30 products, something like that, you know, based on a standard set of assumptions. But the methodology really is about defining how is the team approaching handling that work?
How are they breaking
what tasks are we doing first? Yeah. What are we going to give to the customer to see, right? If we have working software over comprehensive documentation, what is the next piece of working software that we're able to deliver to the customer? So the framework helps us define, you know, should we work on the store first, or should we work on the ability to enter products first. Should we work on theming it early because the visual design is very important to this customer? Should we work on that later? And the methodology of how to pick and choose some of that is a little bit more doing something that works for us.
So it's more about how the work gets done and less about like how much effort or time or cost it takes, right? That's all kind of like an estimate up front with the client.
Yeah, it usually is. And there are some clients who get really good and understanding about Agile and can really understand that, one of the tenets in the Agile Manifesto that Matt brought up, the sentence is, fixed prices are broken promises. It's bold, it's italic, it's got a big period at the end of it. Fixed prices are broken promises. So
somebody should put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, I'm sure it's somewhere. We could check Zazzle. I bet we'll find a few. But I think, you can get some clients who are really good at understanding, I know that there are shops out there who simply price by the sprint, and they say, you get our shop or our team for, X dollars for every 2-week sprint, and you can just keep paying in 2-week increments until your project is done, according to you. And there are some clients who have budgets that will support that. But I think there are so many clients out there who say, that sounds like you're telling me that you don't know how much it will cost, which is generally true, which is generally one of the fundamental tenets of Agile.
Oh, see, I just looked at that and was like, that's amazing. Like, that sounds great. Like, I can say, hey, we're going to do all of these features and do all of this stuff. And I can just keep paying you in 2-week increments until it all gets done. Right.
Yeah.
But then the problem comes when the client doesn't understand. Sometimes there's sprints where I think I'm trying to figure out where to start this rant, I guess. One of the things about Agile is that part of the expectation is that every 2 weeks there's something to show. There's a demo. Right. There's something to release. And the truth is, that's not always the case. Sometimes the sprint is taken up with just discovery and planning and refactoring and debugging and changing course, right? And if you have, and sometimes on complex projects, it also depending on how many resources are on that project, you might have 2, 3, 4 sprints in a row like that, where it's like you're really re-architecting a whole subsystem or something. And those types of situations get risky if you don't have that type of relationship with the client, where you can be like, yeah, we're going to have an 8-week 4 sprints in a row, where you're really not going to, you're going to pay us, but you're not going to have anything to see for that. Now, in waterfall or other agile methodologies, that's a little more hidden because it's a fixed price. They're less likely to get super antsy after a month or two of nothing of particular showing up as features. And you can kind of plan around it and shift things around so you have something that you're delivering. But sometimes it's, depending on the project, that can be unavoidable.
Yeah.
So I want to, this is a perfect opportunity to jump in and I might have to play the tape back to know for sure, but I think that you said, one of the things about Agile is, having to deliver every 2 weeks, having to deliver something every 2 weeks. And that's it was exactly one of the fundamental differences between what you really mean to say there, maybe you did, is Scrum defines that you iterate and deliver every 2 weeks, right? That is a tenet of Scrum. That is not required in Agile. Agile's, there's 12 principles of Agile. And if I scan quick down my list here, retrospectives and adjustment periodically, deliver early and deliver often, favor a small iteration when possible. And then I have a note here. However, a couple of months for these iterations does not mean you're not doing Agile. Right? The iteration should be when you can deliver something that's useful to the client. And that's one of the things that Redfin did, was we immediately just said, nobody wants to meet this frequently. Our clients don't, our workers don't, nobody wants to. So we changed our increment to a month, and we do monthly increments, monthly sprints, and we do demos then.
So let's dig into that a little bit, because I actually, Nick was speaking, and I was kind of like, wait a second, it's not Agile's problem, it's the methodology that you're using's problem. But let's talk about that a little bit, Chris. Like, what is Redfin's preferred methodology, and why? Why do you guys gravitate towards that?
And I think that's a really hard question to ask, right? I think that it's got its own name, right?
It's what we do here.
It's Redfin Agile or something. I don't know. Right. I kind of want to invent Crystal Redfin or something. I don't know, but I would say that it's definitely at this point closest to Kanban. So we've really, when Agile was so hot, I'm trying to think, like, I had maybe DrupalCon Boston 2008 or something, I remember this Agile thing hit me like a ton of bricks, being like, this is what everyone's doing. This is what everyone is talking about. Like, this is the hot topic. And it was conflated with Scrum. So we're like, okay, well, Scrum's the only thing that really matters, right? That was like the lesson that was kind of out there. And so it was like, all right, so we need to take Scrum, we need to take it in-house, and we need to adapt, not adopt. No. Other way around. Adopt, not adapt. We need to just be doing this Scrum thing because this is what everyone's doing. And it just felt like for years we were putting a square peg in a round hole. It just didn't make sense to us. And I said, well, how do you do Agile without doing Scrum? And that's what really started me down this path of like trying to figure out how can we do Agile but better or differently. So we've landed mostly on it is the closest to Kanban, but it's really the fact that we're using a Kanban board because one big backlog makes more sense to us than two backlogs, having the product backlog and then having the sprint backlog. And you know what we find? That we never get everything done in the sprint. And that's not allowed in Scrum. If you commit to it, you're getting it done. But to be quite honest, we don't make our employees work more than 36 hours a week. We just don't do it. So if you don't get it done, that's okay. So having one big backlog where you can just pull from and say, this is what I'm working on now, this is what I'm working on now, it allows our developers to self-organize, which is actually another tenet of one of the 12 principles of Agile, allowing teams to self-organize because those produce the best architecture and docs and designs. So by doing that, we found a huge relief in retrospective guilt is the coin, the phrase I'm going to coin for it, about like, there's 3 tasks that aren't done that we need to carry over into the next sprint.
Yeah. Do you find it to be also a more flexible way of working, right? Because you can kind of reprioritize that Kanban backlog as opposed to like, here's what's in a sprint. Oh, this thing needs to get done. Well, nope, it's got to wait until the end of the sprint, or like we're going to cause a spike or do something weird that's going to be outside of the norm.
Yeah, that was a huge value to us, actually, was being able to see the entire product backlog or just backlog in Kanban at once. Dependencies between tasks are self-evident to smart engineers who can see the whole thing at once. Mm-hmm. So they can easily look down the list and say, here's one that I can grab and work on and make progress on. And I know that I should do this one because I have to do this before I can build this view, right? Like I have to do this before I do this, and they can intuit that and see that a lot more clearly than having 2 separate backlogs.
Well, I have a couple questions, a follow-up question. One is just a short one, which is, you said it's like Kanban. Are you doing Kanban, or are you doing something like Kanban? And like, what is it? And then
yeah. And I'd say that the prescriptions of Kanban is like, again, there's not really anything. I guess we're doing Kanban because we have a Kanban board, which is really the only like key tenet of doing Kanban.
It's like your flavor of Kanban, basically.
Yeah. It's not pure Kanban because Kanban by itself isn't everything you need. But yeah, the biggest thing is making sure that you can see the entire project at once represented by the board. That's the key tenet of Kanban.
So I'm going to throw my follow-up in then, which is a little tougher, I think. I think everything you're saying makes sense for your situation, right?
Mhm.
For an agency, maybe a small number of projects. Most projects are self-contained, and it's like one engineering team per project, probably. And I wonder if we can draw lines around, like, it works really well then, but I wonder how far you can extend it, how you can scale it. And, you know, I'm wearing this hat where at Acquia, we have dozens of engineering teams, and we have people that have to sit above them. And like, it's always my job to like bring a $ hat on, like, into the conversation. Like, at some point, we have a visibility challenge. We're like, I have a certain amount of money, I have certain teams. I want to trust my teams to self-organize, but it does happen, and has happened, where like velocity drops, right? And like, people spend a lot of time and effort and do really good work, but it doesn't turn into a thing that was valuable for the business. And like, what is required in order to make sure a visibility and predictability to make sure you don't get into that situation is an understanding of velocity and explicit dependencies and allocation and resource gaps. And, you know, it sucks, but like, I do think you would run into a wall if you scaled Kanban to a certain point. And it's almost like the same what I asked you before about like the realities of having a budget, the realities of planning far in advance. I guess I want to keep poking on like what the edges of the applicability of the methodology are. So what do you think in terms of how well does that scale? And maybe you wouldn't know this question, but like, what would you do if you needed to scale beyond, you know, your current context?
Yeah. And I think that's where I think the main point of my talk is Agile is whatever works for you, as long as you're, you know, following the 4 values and the 12 principles, right? Are you delivering early and delivering often? So there are methodologies that exist that were built for larger teams, built for doing different types of projects. And I think my main point is exactly what you say, which is this works for us and totally is not what I'm saying. And not evangelizing this. I'm evangelizing going back to strip it down to the bare principles, because I think they're very good and very valuable, and get rid of the methodology that you are trying to force yourself in. You almost have to take tenets of different frameworks and pull them together.
So figure out your own process.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
I like it. I like that.
I think there's just one counterpoint to Matthew. I think your point is a good one, but Kanban was created by Toyota, which you know, is a large organization. I think we would all agree. It's slightly different in manufacturing, I think, than in software. But I think Kanban can. I mean, that's proof. Kanban can expand to that size, but you just need to figure out what those, you know, where those communication boundaries are and blocks are. And I think that's one of the primary things that needs to be solved. And it's not necessarily just, it sounds like that barrier primarily is in between teams, not internal to teams.
That's the hardest spot.
Yeah. And making sure that everything is aligned.
But I also, go ahead, Chris.
Organization size and team size are definitely just 2 very different things. That's why it's like, yes, Kanban works at Toyota, but it might be working because they're working in teams of 6 to 12 or something like that. You know, there's even, I think some of the tenets of Kanban say this falls apart at large scale, right? And so there are other methodologies that start to work a little bit better, right? Like some of the crystal stuff, which again is not very prescriptive. So it is what it is. But like Crystal Orange Web, which was actually designed towards web projects that are being built in the public space, is still designed for teams of 21 to 40, right? Which is like, wow. So we need a Crystal Orange-ish web, you know, like we need how do we get that for maybe teams of less than 10?
Can you explain that? Like, what is Crystal? orange, and web? Like what those words, the background on that?
Yeah. So I'll back up to say that what really got me interested in a lot of this was a very small book. I think the author's name is Ryan Price, and it's just called like Project Management Methodologies. And it just covers all of the different methodologies that were the people who came together and sort of did the Agile Manifesto. They were creating the Agile Manifesto because they were doing things differently at their organizations. And they sort of left that space and then kind of tried to, I don't know, capitalize on what they were doing. So a lot of methodologies came out of that. So there were the Crystal methods, which I think were Alistair Coburn over at IBM. There was Kanban, which happened at Toyota. There was Scrum, which has largely been taken over by like Mountain Goat Software, the big Scrum people, Agile Alliance. So there are several methods that are in like the Crystal family. And there's Crystal Clear, which is designed for small teams specifically. And there's like Crystal Orange Web, and also Crystal Orange. So it's like a web is like a sub flavor of Crystal Orange, and that's designed specifically for web projects. But like, there's not like a Crystal Clear web, which is kind of like something that needs to happen. Like, how do you take tenets of Crystal Orange Web and Crystal Clear and fuse them together in something that works? But I say all this like Crystal methods might be a panacea. I got super excited by them, and then they're really not very prescriptive. Mostly they're prescriptive about roles. There's a ton of roles, and you may or may not have some of these roles. That's one of the ways that you can say that you're doing Crystal. But all they really have is, Crystal really is just made up of 7 properties, which are very similar. They're from the tenets of Agile mostly. So frequent delivery. So, we already know about that. Reflective improvement. So you have to have retrospectives or you're not doing Crystal. Some kind of retrospective. Osmotic communication is actually an important one for Crystal, which is so important. It's one of the big tenets of Agile that is super overlooked these days, which is that the best way for any team to communicate is face-to-face. Hard stop. And, maybe because this was early 2000s and it's certainly pre-COVID, but so many of these methodologies rely on face-to-face communication and co-located offices. And so osmotic communication is the idea that because we're all in an open, like Crystal basically dictates open office plans. It's like, it's got to be open, because if I turn around and talk to my colleague, someone else is maybe overhearing that and being able to jump in and say, oh, you know what? I actually solved this problem 2 weeks ago on a different project. You should check out this custom module I built for this project and check it out here, which is another growing pain that we went through at Redfin. We used to subscribe to this tenet called default to open, which came to us from actually a Drupal camp that I put together in Boone, North Carolina back in like 2010, I think, or something. And we had Chris Grams, who's now at Tidelift, but was at Red Hat at the time, come and be our keynote speaker. And he talked a lot about this like default to open. And so our main mechanism for osmotic communication while being remote was to like put everything in the general channel, like have all conversations in it was like old IRC days where you have one channel. And as our company grew, people were bothered by the noise of all of that. But it really ended up getting rid of some of that osmotic communication, because people were thinking, oh, I need to talk just to the people who are interested in my specific problem on this specific project. But it actually ruined the opportunity for someone to sort of overhear a conversation and inject themselves into it.
Yeah, so I think interestingly, I think other organizations that I've worked at have solved that by creating like specific channels for specific communication, right? So if somebody on a development team had a development question, like, oh, I'm having this problem, has anybody else had that problem? Like, you can basically talk to a subset of the team as opposed to just posting everything into a general channel, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are other ways of kind of like tackling that one.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with being intentional about that growth. And our channels grew very organically and very much into project-based channels, and not role focus channels, like here's all the developers. And again, like kind of to Matt's point, our company's 10 whole people. So, 7 of them are 8 of them, 9 of them are developers. So
are you one of them?
Yeah. My cohort, he doesn't do as much development these days, but he's still enough to be able to answer questions. So
it's just interesting that you bring up default to open floor plan. You're kind of talking about some pros and cons of remote work there, which I think about a lot. I'm a remote worker for like 10 years or something, and Akwi is like very remote first friendly, which I greatly appreciate for personal reasons. And the corporation having a remote first posture overcomes a lot of the inherent challenges. But your other point, which is also related, like it's kind of segmentation versus combination, just generally. And at scale, that becomes such a balance. And the truth is, there are pros and cons to segmenting and pros and cons to combining. And like there is no way to hit a balance where you don't get the cons. And it's just really hard.
And not to sound like a broken record, but again, that's my point, is you have to, because it's interactions and people over processes and tools, you have to look at your specific people and you have to figure out what works for that group of people. And it means that your agile methodology might be changing from time to time as you get turnover in teams or whatever it happens to be.
Do any other methodologies have web specific versions, or is it just kind of Crystal that has that subset?
Yeah. And that I wish that the answer to that was yes, and it's not. I've not really found anything else that's really web specific. Not necessarily that everything needs to be, but it was nice that Crystal Orange web is sort of designed in one particular way. But there's, I think there's a handful of other methods we haven't even talked about, like feature-driven development, extreme programming, and DSDM, which is kind of a wild hybrid of, not really a hybrid of waterfall, but it kind of, it's agile for companies that really didn't want to let go of waterfall. But I really liked feature-driven development for a while. I was super hot on it for a while, but again, we tried it and it didn't work for us, which was clients, customers, they look at features, right? As we build a Drupal website, they're looking at like, all right, well, there's a news feature, there's a events feature, there's a blog feature, there's a whatever. And so we actually tried building the feature soup to nuts in more vertical silos. So we actually would build, theme, and migrate the whole blog, for example. And then we would build, theme, and migrate events and do all of the custom functionality for that. And it was slower than where we landed now, which is actually to just kind of work on building everything out first, then work on the custom functionality and the theming, and just do the whole site build first, all the content types, taxonomies, all of that. So we tried that FDD thing for a while, and we just didn't like it, and we backed out of it.
The same dynamics of segmentation versus combination, and the
exactly. Yeah, how to approach it. But
I think. Go ahead, John.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think. And fundamentally, that feels like it's going back towards waterfall, because I think one of the benefits of waterfall that people always try to get back is like there's efficiency in doing the same thing together, right? Which is I think what you're getting to. Like if I'm configuring content types, like sitting there and just configuring content types all at once allows me to do things like catch like, oh, I created 3 different header field machine names, but they could all be the same header field and just reuse them. Or we have 4 different theme list options for all the different components, and maybe we can collapse those into 2 different options or something. Or maybe we need to split this out to 2 vocabularies for some reason. Like if you're doing them globally, you can kind of think about it differently than if you're doing it as a silo. And same thing with theming. If you're building the theme at the same time, you're more likely to create a mix-in or something that allows you to reuse code in an intelligent way than if you're creating them in a silo. If you create them in a silo, you're probably just creating everything from scratch. Like getting that global view is very, very difficult. But I think we just kind of need Agile, Scrum, Crystal, Web, Waterfall, and everything will be perfect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I want to actually circle back to something that we were talking about a little earlier, and Matthew was talking about like scalability, right? And like how larger organizations kind of like scale project teams to kind of and the methodologies they use, right? So part of the reason, selfishly, that this topic is interesting to me is because right now my project team is actually talking about moving agile methodologies. And we talked to our Scrum coach and was like, hey, if we switch methodologies from like the rest of what the organization is using, is that okay? And he said, yeah, as long as it works for you, right? And Chris, we were having some of the same problems you were talking about with like, you know, flexibility and being able to kind of see a list and being able to like prioritize things in certain ways and stuff like that. So a lot of what you're saying, it was resonating, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on a large company or even maybe a small company using different agile methodologies with different project or product teams.
Yeah. And I think that it's an organizational decision, but I don't see any reason why it couldn't be successful. You know, I think a lot of it depends on company culture and how our teams really empowered to be self-organizing. You know, if this team chooses to work in way X, is that okay inside of this company's culture? Yeah. You know, I know that if I had scaled Redfin to, you know, from 10 to 50 people, that would definitely be a thing that we'd say is like, well, if that works for your team and you're the manager of this team, then go for it. Because again, interactions and people over processes and tools.
Yeah, we're also seeing like from my personal experience here, we're seeing like the difference in the type of work, right? Makes a difference, right? So our project or product team originally was working on MVP. So it was more like a project where there was like a start and a finish, right? But now we've moved into more feature development and like product enhancement and support.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like we're kind of seeing like, okay, now like 2-week sprints don't really make sense because like in that 2 weeks, somebody says this is really important, needs to get done right away. And it kind of blows away that like, hey, we set the sprint, now we deliver the sprint mentality. Yeah. So, you know, I think, you know, my feeling is like, hey, you should do whatever makes the most sense for both your project and your team to again, satisfy the client's, you know, the goals and needs, right?
Yeah. That's extra funny because we have one of our most successful, pretty pure Scrum is ongoing. The Scrum, we kind of felt like we were shoehorning it during the project phase, but now that we're in long-term maintenance phase, 2-week iterations, regular meetings, and building in what's going to be delivered in the next 2-week iteration has worked really well in ongoing for us and not for the initial build.
Interesting.
And I think it's a lot that our client is very well educated on what does an emergency make. And we do have we have a separate list where they enter what they call hot fixes, which are the emergencies. And they understand that every time they put something in there, something falls out of this sprint. And so they're very cautious about, can I actually live with this until the next sprint? And so they really only put something in the hot fixes if it's truly broken or really causing an issue, or, you know, the chancellor at the university said this has to be done by tomorrow. But yeah, but typically I find in projects like 2-week sprints are almost nothing. And then they lead to over meetings. We even actually, that's another thing that we just absolutely threw away from Scrum is daily stand-ups. Do weekly stand-up. And it works so much better. I do a 20 to 30 minute every Monday at 1 with the same format, except I change day to week. What did you work on last week? What do you plan on working on this week? What's in your way? And it's also an opportunity to say, here are some things coming down the pike for you guys, in a week or two, new projects that we might be signed, things that you might be working on. And so it's, again, I trust my team. They're very self-organizing, and I don't need an update more than every week, especially because I don't need to demo to the client more than every month. So relaxing those cycles has been so helpful to us.
And I'm assuming you have open paths of communication within your team. So if somebody's blocked by something, they can say, hey, I'm blocked by you not doing this. Like, can you tell me when you're going to have it done? That sort of thing.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what it's like. My team never got to a point where they wanted to wait to tell someone about a blocker until the next morning's stand-up.
Right.
So it never made sense anyway, because my team was unblocking each other and unblocking themselves organically throughout the day. If they got blocked at 2 p.m., they would throw a little message out and say, I'm stuck on this and that. Can anyone hop on a call? Or, Chris, can you get an answer from the client? And I would do that. So,
I
it just
imagine
wasn't necessary.
I imagine those weekly blocker type things become more organizational or client or architectural type things, where it requires discussion with multiple team members, or maybe longer term planning or something, and doesn't warrant maybe, or is further in the future. So it doesn't really warrant, like, you're not immediately blocked, but it's like, hey, I have this blocker
it's
coming
definitely a lot of that.
In a week or two, make sure we prioritize this.
If I don't get this piece of information from the client by the end of this week, I can't start on X by next week. And so then everyone's got a good relaxed timeline to try to get back to the client and get the information they need. So,
I think just another point there, like, don't be afraid to just change your cadence. Like, it doesn't have to be always once a week or always once a day. I often find when I'm starting projects, you need to meet more frequently up front. Just get on the same page, there's more questions, and it's going to taper off. And then maybe it'll get more intense around a big delivery or something like that, where you're all unblocking each other. But it's very hard. But I always try to make teams feel like they can just break the rules. Like, whatever the rule is, just do what works. And people aren't comfortable with that. It's really hard. And I guess the another point is people need to feel like they aren't blocked because they can't have a meeting. That drives me crazy. They're like, we can't find something on the calendar for these 5 people for 2 weeks, so we're not going to make any progress in 2 weeks. Which is just like, we'll just find a way to do it asynchronously. That's it. That mentality is part of, like, the daily stand-up, the weekly stand-up. That it's this rigidity of process, but you do have to create a culture where people feel empowered to break it, because they don't feel like they're allowed to in so many situations. That's really the key. It
almost feels like a I don't know, it's going to be negative, and it's I don't know, it's not really meant to be, but it almost feels like a micromanager's tool, right? To say, like, we're going to have daily stand-ups to make sure that, like, you're doing what you need to be doing, because, like, somebody higher up needs to make sure that the employees are doing what they need to be doing, like, on a daily basis. But
and that's exactly what it felt like.
Like, sometimes you need a daily meeting because you're in a crisis and things aren't working, and it actually is coming in and saying, listen, I'm not going to always micromanage you, but I need to micromanage you for a week, because things are not on the right course. Anyway, just kind of related question to what we were talking about previously is combination of methodologies like Scrumban. So, I mean, is that something that you've tried or have thoughts on?
Yeah. And I think that a lot of those exist simply to put a name on someone who's doing, not to sound like a broken record, what I'm saying, which is finding the thing that works for you. So somebody said, oh, you know what works for us? Scrum, but without the 2 backlogs, right? So it's like, oh, let's name it Scrumban, right? And it's like, it's kind of like, I don't know, Crystal Redfin. We'll just call it whatever we want to call it. But it's really about, did you take the tenets of all the different methodologies, read them through, and figure out what works for you? So my hunch is, like, I've probably used Scrumban not knowing it or not calling it what it is. And I've probably done, it's Scrumfall, one of the other ones, without really knowing it.
It definitely sounds like it. And in the show notes, there is a a visual that kind of describes or compares Scrum to Kanban to Scrumban, because which is really still hard for me to say. But anyway, that's actually the methodology that my team is moving towards. And it makes so much more sense for kind of where we are right now, that I'm like, where has this been my whole life? Why aren't we working like this always? But yeah, it's interesting. It actually answers that question, Nick, that you were talking about reducing meetings, right? Because now meetings aren't required. You only have meetings when you need to have meetings, and it's kind of a little bit more freeing and a little bit more flexible.
Yeah, I think it's a symptom of one of those things where I think somebody mentioned this earlier, but Agile kind of started in a really large company, probably, where they had multi-year turnaround on some stuff, and they figured out that if they changed process, they could speed things up significantly. And then everybody just started saying oh, that's a recipe to make us more productive. Let's just do it without thinking about it. And then you end up in these Scrum daily stand-ups with 40 people on them, and yeah, they might last 15 minutes, but you're not really getting anything of value in those 15 minutes. And they have to be every single day. And then if you're a consultant like me 6 years ago, you had basically 4 stand-ups a day, 5 stand-ups a day with every single client. Trying and scheduling those became painful. But I think the core thing is what you've been saying, Chris, is think about your project management and make adjustments. And I think that'll help.
Like what Matt said, don't be afraid to break the rules. I think that my journey, the real lesson that I wanted to share with folks about this is I kind of felt like we were told you have to do Scrum to be anyone these days. Yeah. And so we did, and we were just spent a lot of years probably, square peg round hole, until we finally gave ourselves the permission to say, we hate this and it doesn't work. And there are a few things that do work, and we have to be open to, my original goal here was there's got to be another Agile framework out there that will work better. So this book that gave an overview of all the different ones was feature-driven development's the answer. And then we tried it and it was that doesn't work, but it does have this and this. It's is Crystal the answer? Is extreme programming the answer? Is DSDM the answer? And really the answer is you gotta roll your own.
Yeah, it's funny. In that pause right there, I was going to say retirement is the answer.
Okay, that would be option one if given it. But
I like
right now, no, gonna keep working.
It should just be roll your own Agile methodology. That's the name of the next talk.
Oh, I like that. It's better than what I had. Letting Agile emerge, though, that was the idea that we waited to see what floated to the top and what people, we loved certain tenets of it, and we hated others. So we wanted to see what floated to the top and pick that stuff out.
So we have a listener question from Shivan, also known as X Amount, from the Talking Drupal Slack. So if you have any questions for future episodes, feel free to post them there for us. And he was asking, story points are usually based on a Fibonacci sequence rather than direct hours. And so user story of 2 points estimation doesn't really mean 2 hours of work, really. What do you think the best practice is? Should it correlate directly with hours? If not, what do you think about that?
Yeah. The first thing I'll say is we hated points, so we got rid of them.
Interesting.
One of the things in Scrum that did not work for us. It worked really well one time with one client who really got it. And we said, okay, you're coming into this e-commerce build project and your boss told you we need a new feature. And we've estimated that new feature is a 13. So you got to get rid of 13 other points here. And they were either able to take them out and move them back to the someday list, or go back to their boss and say, I'm not going to do it because it means I got to get rid of this, this, and this, but almost never. The points are mostly used in calculating velocity. I find. So it's kind of like, all right, we put 160 points behind us in the last increment. At this pace, we'll be done with the current backlog by June. And we found that the points usually come out in the wash because we are not, for example, this is where it could get dangerous. If you save all your 13-point stories for, later in the project, then it's going to mess up your velocity. But for us, every iteration, increment, sprint is a mix of everything from 1s to 13s anyway. So we just count the number of tickets and we just say 13 tickets got done this sprint of 170. And so at this pace, we'll be done by September. So we just kind of count them all as the same weight.
How does that work? So do you put hour values like, oh, this is going to take 3 hours, this is going to take 6 hours? Like, how does that work if they're all the same? Like,
we don't do anything because we're doing Kanban. So we're letting people pull off the stack what is the next logical thing for them to do or build. And then when we reflect, like at the demo for a month, after the first month, we say, okay, we got 26% of the tickets done in the last month. And so we'll need 3 more of these increments to get it done. And then at update 2, we say, okay, we're at 40%. So we're actually off a little bit. That's what Agile is anyway. It's just that moving target of when it will be done versus what's in the backlog. So before getting rid of story points altogether, there's also very much like a very firm points are not hours. Never try to equate points to hours. And so the first thing we did was one of the rules we got rid of. And we just said points
that never
are
made
roughly
sense to
hours.
That never
points
made
are
sense
hours.
to me.
Funny.
Like,
what
why?
We would then calculating our hours per point.
We actually calculated story points to days. So like half day, whole day, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to hours, because it was like, I don't know, half day. It's going to take 4, it's going to take, it could take up to 4 hours. Right. But it's like just saying story points don't have a correlation to time at all is just, it's weird to me. So,
it's not true anyway. Even if you say it's true, it's not true.
Well, right.
And it's also like, why do we force other humans to do things that are totally unnatural to humans? Like unitless measurements. Our brains don't work like that. We quantify things. That's
based on the Fibonacci sequence. Like what?
Don't go against the grain. Just do what comes naturally. Come on.
Yeah. The one thing that was helpful was being able to put points on it for a developer, and saying that these are roughly hours did give our developers an understanding of, am I spinning my wheels here? When should I reach out for help? Like, I know that this is a 13, so if it takes me longer than whatever we decide, it's 2 days, I should be reaching out for help.
I think it's also a little bit tough on the client planning piece of it too, right? So like if you're building out a product and you're beholden to a client who's beholden to some other folks, right? Mm-hmm. Like you want to give them a rough estimate. So I think like that, I don't know, that aspect of it is kind of interesting. And we could definitely go on a tangent about velocity, because I think there are other ways you can measure success depending on what your agile methodology is. But we may or may not have to save that for another episode. Chris, I want to thank you for your time. As always, it's been super enlightening, super interesting, and always a joy.
Always happy to be here, and love talking to everyone and getting the word out.
For our listeners, do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD-promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for your support for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that big Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, Chris, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about the various things that you're doing, how could they do that?
I am at Chris from Redfin on just about all the things, but I am not spending much time on X these days, but the Mastodon is where it's at. There's a lot of great Drupal stuff there. Chris from Redfin over on Mastodon.
And this will be out on Monday, so they can find you at DrupalCon as well, right?
That's right. Come in and pick my brain about project management.
Awesome. Matthew, what about you?
Grasmash everywhere. Also, I'm not really using X too much anymore. So, but you can email me, and it's easy because it's just matt.grasmick@gmail. Personal email address, Grasmick's GRASMICK.
And I'm assuming they can find you floating around the Acquia booth at DrupalCon.
You can find me at, well, hopefully not at the booth too much, but floating around DrupalCon somewhere more interesting.
There you go. Fair enough. Nick, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan and STXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can also find me at DrupalCon. But if you're looking for me on the internet, you can find me on all the major social networks, as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.